So we've got, you mentioned 80 Sci-Fi, which is, to say so, it's like one of only 2 magazines in Canada that are Science Fiction Writers of America magazines where your credentials, like if you get sold there, that's...
they're joining the association.
Yeah, exactly. But you mentioned Pseudopod, and I don't listen to Pseudopod. I've never listened to a single one. I don't want to be scared of anything.
It's scary, really.
But no, the Pseudopod is worth, like, has anybody listened to any of the Escape Artist stuff?
Okay.
Yeah, I am absolutely sold. I listen to a lot of short fiction because I don't have time, like Geoff says, around my son and writing and work, there's nothing left. So the short fiction comes in for me on the bus, and I listen to it. I don't want to read something on I don't have a tablet or anything. And so Escape Artist has Escape Pod, which is for science fiction, escapepod.org. You have pseudopod.org, which is horror, and then you've got Podcastle, which is fantasy. And Escape Pod was started by an editor called Steve Ely, and he had his philosophy, his vision was very clear, and he said this most times he put on his podcast: I want to make something where you have a bit of fun on the way on your commute. And that's it. He just wanted to cheer people up. He said, we're not going to print depressing stuff. Sometimes it's going to be serious, but for the most part it's going to be pretty upbeat, which is why a lot of my fiction never appeared there. But he developed this, and it took off, and his business model was, give me donations. If you like this, send me some donations so I can pay my authors.
And that's, yeah, Ceaseless Skies, the new Ceaseless Skies.
Does that too?
Yeah, they have a donation. You can subscribe to their e-reader list, or you can buy their anthology.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, how they managed to fund their writing.
They have a low overhead, that's for sure.
Oh, yeah,
right?
that's
and like,
true.
they have to pay their authors, but other than that, they're not paying for printing. So, but I would highly recommend the Escape Pod and the podcast. I would not at all recommend Pseudopod. Yeah, I have but what else is out there? Have you read other stuff?
Those are the main 2
Yeah.
for me. I mean, I did Beneath Ceaseless Skies is on my to-read list, and I deal answer as well.
I think you'd like Beneath Ceaseless Skies, actually. Like, their whole raison d'etre is, we're going to create a whole world. Like, they don't want urban fantasy. They don't want, your knights in shining armor riding around fantasy. They don't want anything contemporary. They're looking for a wholly constructed fantasy world, and that's the sort of thing that I go for. And the thing that I also like about them is the adventure fantasy side. And
yeah.
They do have some weird westerns on there too. They
Yeah,
kind
they
of
do.
got me into weird westerns as well.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
That was my first ever experience with a weird western, and I really liked it. I'm having trouble with that as a tongue twister. Weird western. There we go.
Say it to me next time.
Yeah. But you can also get weird westerns on Podcastle. There's some really good ones by some fantastic authors. I will mention a couple of other places. There's also Clark's World. They're another professional market. They put out their stuff in e and in audio. Lightspeed magazine, well, before that, Clark's World was nominated for Hugo, so I mean, they're a big deal. They're getting first-class authors there, and I believe that one of their authors won the Hugo this year, E. Lily Yu, who's only 22 years old, one of the youngest Hugo winners ever, for her story, The Cartographer Wasps and the Anarchist Bees, which was just a brilliant, brilliant story. And I thought that it should have come in second to Paper Menagerie by Ken Liu, which appeared in Podcast later on. But it originally had been, I think, in FNSF. So Clark's World, awesome. And the other one that's really big is Lightspeed. I think everybody should check that out. And you'll see a very different editorial vision. Lightspeed is, has anybody read Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine? Their assistant editor used to be John Joseph Adams, and he went off to become the editor and publisher now of Fantasy Magazine, the online version, and Lightspeed, the sci-fi magazine online. So he decided to put the two of them together, and it's one magazine now called Lightspeed, and there's, I believe, 26 or 52 stories a year, and some of them are in audio, some of them are, all of them are in E, and then he's also starting a new magazine called Nightmare, which it sounds like you'd like it, Jeff.
I've heard of it. I've seen some information.
I don't intend to go anywhere near it. I don't even want to go to their webpage.
What can I say?
Now, Geoff, just as an aside, Geoff once spooked me out with one of his stories that he gave us to critique, and so I was like, there's something coming up from the water to grab somebody's foot, and I was like, no, don't do this to me.
That should be appearing next month in Night Watch Press.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, good.
So it's coming
Good.
up.
I'm trying to think of what other magazines. We've got Idiomancer as well as online. It's much more of a literary style, but you'll hear more about that. What are some of your favorite stories that you've heard on Pseudopod?
Well, the one that really stands out was one of advancing right now.
Do you notice, like, oh, sorry, you've only listened to one.
Okay, I've really just gotten into it, but it's completely sold me on the concept.
And how many Beneath Ceaseless Sky stories did you read?
I managed to get through 1.5 issues.
Oh, 1.5 issues, okay.
Yeah. So, but there are 2 stories each issue.
Yeah.
So I read When Averly Fell from the Sky, which was actually kind of creepy, and Bandit and the 70 Raccoon Woman, and then I read one story from ages ago, which I can't even remember now. So.
Did you notice an editorial style? Like,
Actually, the stories all felt really familiar. Maybe it's just the style of writing that I'm used to reading, but yeah.
But that's...
There was...
What?
When Averly Fell from the Sky was a steampunk story, so there seems to be a lot more of that as opposed to like the high fantasy I haven't really read. Of course, I haven't read it extensively, so there probably is a fair amount of high fantasy, but I haven't really read it.
One thing that's very interesting is you can go back and get their whole back catalog all at once, and you can read all of it if you like it, or listen to all of it if you like it. That's what I actually did with Escape Pod. I started at about issue 80, and so I just downloaded all of them, started at 1, and went all the way through, and that way it comes in order and you can follow. But one thing is when you listen to Escape Pod for 80 issues, you really get a sense of the editorial vision. Like, I can now say, this is what an Escape Pod story is like, and I can say, yeah, I can't see that they would have that there.
One thing I would add, at least I'm speaking for the stories with Pseudopod, is they do introduce the story at the beginning.
Yeah.
They talk to you a little bit about the author, and if they had a conversation with the author beforehand, they'll at least give you a little idea of how the story came about, so you can understand where the author was coming from. So it really, it's sort of like, it's a substitute for the little frontispiece before a story in an anthology where they talk about the author, how many dogs they have, and where they live, and everything.
But fantasy, it's cats.
Cats, yeah.
Yes, yes it is.
Or it's probably rats or whatever. But anyhow, it's a nice way of setting the tone. And sometimes the one who introduces the story will even provide a little bit of insight. But I think this story really does a nice job of summarizing these sorts of ideas. You don't have to take their word for it, but it at least primes your mind for what's going to come.
Actually, that's quite nice. That little critical.
Yeah, they don't do that on Beneath Ceaseless Skies. In the Escape Artists, all 3, they have an intro and an outro.
Oh, yes.
And in the intro, they do this is where the person comes from, this is how many cats they were issued.
They were issued?
Yeah, this is where their work is for.
In the fantasy army.
Yeah.
You get 2 cats.
Yes, exactly. They do that, and I do appreciate that as well, because then, like, for somebody like, let's say, let's throw out some names of people who are doing really well. E. Lily Yu, who won the Hugo, definitely somebody who, if I see her name in a magazine now, I'm definitely going to look her up. Somebody who I like a lot, who's appeared a lot in Beneath Ceaseless Skies and a lot in Podcastle, is Saladin Ahmad. And he is a guy who writes fantasy. He writes positive sort of fantasy, and he writes weird westerns, some really good weird westerns. But he's got a really weird view on things, and he also brings a Middle Eastern flavor to a lot of his stuff. Obviously, because he's got some of that culture. Like, he grew up in Michigan, but I mean, he's obviously got ancestry from there, and so that he can touch that culture and import it. Somebody else who I think is pretty amazing is Aliette de Baudal. She's been nominated for Hugo or Nebula, and I think it's a Nebula. Maybe she's been nominated for 2. She is half Vietnamese, I believe, half French, and for some reason is writing in English. She lives in France. I met her at Worldcon in 2009, and a lot of the time her work is around what would happen if Mesoamerican empires had not died and they were now in the
That's
present.
really cool.
It is really cool.
That's a detective stories based on involving.
In her novels?
Yes.
I haven't read her novels, but the thing is, there was one like, you've got characters called, 375 Jaguar, which is like the kind of Mesoamerican names that you had, and there was one about blood sacrifices and astronauts and stuff, like astronauts that you would have gotten 1,200 years after the Aztecs or something, which is, like, Eliot de Bodar is somebody else you should keep an eye on. Ken Liu as well, got nominated for the Hugo, the Nebula this year.
Wow.
And you'll hear about those you might have heard about those in the Hugo ones, yeah. Well, what other names were at the Hugo Nebula ones?
Nancy Folda, or
I paneled with her at Worldcon. Yeah.
That we discussed that extensively in the last panel session. Resnick's The Homecoming. Yeah,
Resnick is one of those authors who writes like about 30 short stories a year, plus 2 novels, so we all hate him. But he's won more Hugos than anybody alive in history, whatever, like he's just won more Hugos. I think he's got 20 or 25. It's insane. And he is a regular contributor to Asimov's and regularly is on the Hugo ballot. So I mean, he's a definite crowd pleaser for your standard sci-fi.
I mean, actually, I think we should mention that when we get to the Hugo and Nebula Awards nomination season, they do put the stories up, at least the short stories, at least are available for free.
Well, Escape Pod does that. What they'll do is they'll do Hugo sweeps, and so when the nominees come out, they'll try and contact the people who are on the ballot, say, well, we'll pay you $300 for your story so that we can play it, and then they put those on. So a lot of my Hugo nominee exposure has been through Escape Pod, because you just do the Hugo sweeps every year, and you can see exactly what was nominated, and stuff like Bridesicle. I think he got nominated last year for Bridesicle or something, which I found, wow, I can't remember that story, but it was, who else is good?
I think that's one or two
Please,
other
Paul. Yeah.
Two of my favorites are Strange Horizon.
Oh, that's true.
Beautiful U.S.-based, published a little bit like great hard science fiction, some really wacky like mappy science fiction, some stuff a little bit more towards fantasy. So it's a really broad market. And also the publisher Tor has
Tor.com
regularly publishes online shorts, and they're typically very high quality.
Do you like their stuff?
I mean, they've got a specific feel.
Yeah.
It tends to be more the crowd pleasing stuff, a little bit less.
Yeah,
I never find like math fiction on there.
No, I didn't find them edgy enough, and I listened to some of their stuff, and I never got the sense that it was anything else other than we're going to tease you with the stories of one of our writers so that you go buy their novels. Like it,
a bit. I mean, there's some fantastic stories on there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, their stuff does get nominated, but I mean, it's just that, like I'm saying, I look for the edgier stuff, like the stuff that's a little more out there. There was an absolutely fantastic story in the first 10 issues of Escape Pod, which was like the Gumball Prince of Hollywood or something, I forget, or the Silicon Valley. It's just brilliant stuff, like just way weird. Saladin Ahmed just wrote one, I think, which was a weird Western that appeared in like issue 292 of Podcastle, which was Buried Eyes, I think it was. And I recommended it to absolutely everybody. It's called Buried Eyes. Absolutely fantastic. And way out there. Yeah, Eugene, you had a
When
question?
you talked about the nominees, and there's more than just the nominees, if you go looking, you can find the list of all of the people who were nominated who didn't make not the 5 nominees for a category list.
Yeah.
And that's a good resource too.
Yeah, it is. Do you what do you do online magazines, Eugene?
Not a lot. No.
No?
I read once in a while something that catches, somebody says something, and I'll go and find it and read it. But
Yeah, that's kind of like me. Yeah, a bit of a Luddite reading.
Yeah.
Something in my hand.
Go ahead.
When you talk about you like the stuff that's on the cutting edge, does the free online market, because it's free and online, have a bent towards that kind of stuff because it's a lot more difficult to get it into mainstream?
I
would imagine so. I would think, well, some mainstream publishers have a very set, this is what will sell, even though publishers will freely admit that you have no idea what will really sell.
But